The investigation ended. The file was stamped. The conclusion was written. And the case, at least on paper, was finished. There was no courtroom drama, no lingering public debate, no unresolved headlines demanding answers. The explanation was accepted because it arrived with confidence, because it carried official language, because it offered relief in a moment when certainty was needed more than complexity. And for a long time, no one questioned it. Records were archived. Attention moved elsewhere. Time did what time often does. It smoothed the edges of doubt until doubt no longer seemed necessary. This was not considered a mystery. It was not treated as unfinished. It was remembered as something already understood. But understanding and resolution are not the same thing. Because even as the conclusion settled into public memory, there was one problem it never addressed. Not a dramatic flaw, not an obvious error, just a detail, small enough to ignore, quiet enough to dismiss, ordinary enough to explain away. Yet that detail remained unchanged, no matter how often the story was retold. And when years passed, when records were revisited, when assumptions were re-examined, when the sequence of events was laid out without urgency, something became difficult to reconcile. The certainty had arrived too quickly, not because the explanation was impossible, but because it required too many questions to go unanswered. This is not a story about accusation. It is not about rewriting history. It is about a moment when an ending was reached before the process of understanding had finished. And what happens when time gives us the distance to notice what certainty once concealed. The case unfolded in a country where institutions were trusted not because they claimed perfection, but because they represented order. This was a period when authority still carried weight, when official statements were repeated rather than questioned, when the assumption was not that investigators were infallible, but that they were thorough. The region itself was unremarkable in the way most places are. Quiet neighborhoods, predictable routines, a sense that serious crime was rare enough to feel distant, even when it appeared close to home. In this environment, investigations followed a familiar pattern. An incident was reported. Responders documented what they saw. Supervisors reviewed the findings. A conclusion was reached. Each step reinforced the next. At the time, investigative work relied heavily on observable facts and professional judgment. Forensic science existed, but it was not yet defined by the precision people expect today. Digital records were limited. Cross-agency data sharing was minimal. What mattered most was coherence. Did the evidence form a story that made sense? Did the explanation align with experience? Did it fit what investigators had seen before? If the answer was yes, the process moved forward. Public confidence followed naturally. News reports reflected official findings without reinterpretation. Language was cautious, formal, and brief. Once a conclusion was announced, it was rarely revisited unless new information forced the issue. And new information rarely arrived. This was not because questions were forbidden. It was because questions were considered unnecessary once a case had been classified as resolved. A solved case meant closure. It meant no outstanding threat, no unresolved concern, no reason to revisit the past. For families, it offered an explanation, sometimes imperfect but final. For institutions, it represented completion. For the public, it became something understood, then forgotten. There was also a cultural factor at work. In this era, challenging official outcomes required persistence, access, and credibility, resources most people did not have. The idea that an investigation could be both complete and incomplete at the same time was not part of the public conversation. If something had been missed, it was assumed there was a reason. If a detail had been set aside, it was assumed to be irrelevant. The system was designed to move forward, not to pause. And in most cases, it worked. But systems built for efficiency are not always designed for reflection. They prioritize resolution over reconsideration. They depend on early interpretations. And once a conclusion is reached, every subsequent decision tends to support it. This is not a failure of intent. It is a characteristic of process. The investigation at the center of this story followed that process precisely as it was understood at the time. There was no urgency to look beyond the explanation that fit. No pressure to reopen what appeared complete. No expectation that years later, someone might read the same records and see something different. Because in that world, a solved case was not a starting point for discussion. It was the end. At the end of May 1980, a young woman named Jessie Victoria Earl left home in Eastbourne on the southeastern coast of England. She was known to enjoy long walks along the cliffs and headlands that define this seaside town, places where the land meets the sea in steep drops and silent winds. She spoke to her mother from a phone box near the seafront. It was a short call, a mundane moment that would, in hindsight, carry so much weight. When Jessie did not return, concern grew. Days passed. Family and friends searched. The local police joined the efforts. Initial inquiries covered the expected ground. Interviews with acquaintances, checks of local pubs and transport hubs, and searches of paths and fields where she might have wandered. Then, nearly a decade later, in 1989, the remains of Jessie Earl were discovered by chance in a thicket of undergrowth on Beachy Head, a sheer chalk promontory that overlooks the English Channel. What investigators found was more troubling than just a body. Forensic analysis showed she had been left with her bra tied around her wrists, and she was without her clothes or personal effects. The official response at the time was shaped by the limited evidence available to them. There was no clear sign of a struggle at the scene, and no definitive indication of how long she had been there. Because of this lack of conclusive forensic linkage, the death was classified as an open verdict, meaning the coroner concluded that there was insufficient evidence to determine whether her death was the result of a crime. To the authorities, this open verdict was not unusual. Cases where circumstances could not be definitively explained ended this way often, especially before modern forensic techniques became widespread. Public understanding of an open verdict was limited. Many equated it with meaning unresolved, while others saw it as a neutral, almost administrative classification. There is also a procedural consequence that would echo into the future. Because the death was not officially recorded as murder, key forensic evidence, including samples that might have been preserved for future testing, was destroyed in 1997. Friends and family of Jessie never accepted the notion that there was insufficient evidence to suspect foul play. They saw what had been found, the bindings around her wrists, the absence of her belongings, the isolated location, and could not reconcile it with natural causes or misadventure. For nearly 2 decades, the case remained in a sort of legal and social limbo. It existed in files and archive rooms, occasionally referenced, occasionally forgotten. There were whispers among those who followed the case and persistent questions from family members, but no systemic push to revisit what had occurred. This was a time before genetic genealogy, before ubiquitous digital record-keeping, and before the technological advances that would later change the way decades-old mysteries could be evaluated. Investigators in the 1980s worked with the tools of their time. Interviews, fingerprints, witness statements, and physical evidence capable of direct comparison. Without a clearly identifiable suspect or direct forensic link, the open verdict stood. And in the absence of that technical connection, the story of what had happened to Jessie Earl was placed into a category that many in law enforcement considered neutral. Neither confirmed accidental death nor proven homicide. It was unresolved, not because it was mysterious, but because it was unclassified. Only in the early 2000s did a renewed push, led by continued concern from family and episodic media attention, prompt authorities to take a fresh look. The focus shifted not only to why the original verdict was open, but to whether the evidence that existed was being interpreted through the lens of outdated assumptions. Evidence that had once seemed insufficient was now subjected to new lines of inquiry. But because that evidence had been compromised by procedural decisions, key samples destroyed, opportunities passed, investigators faced an uphill battle. What remained were fragments of a story, pieces of a life, and questions that had not been addressed when they first should have been. And so, in this quiet stretch of time, Between what was recorded and what was understood, Jesse Earl's death existed as both a conclusion and a question. It was neither accepted nor rejected. It was simply cataloged. And what happens when an incident sits long enough in that space, as neither resolved nor truly examined, becomes the focus of this documentary. When authorities reviewed the discovery at Beachy Head, they were faced with a difficult reality. The remains of Jessie Victoria Earl had been exposed to the elements for years. Time, weather, and terrain had erased many of the markers investigators rely on to reconstruct final moments with certainty. What could be documented was recorded carefully. What could not be confirmed was left open. The coroner's findings reflected that limitation. There was no definitive medical cause of death that could be established beyond doubt. No witness came forward with first-hand knowledge of what had happened after Jessie's final phone call. No forensic result connected another person directly to the scene. And so, in accordance with the standards of the time, the death was recorded with an open verdict. An open verdict did not declare innocence or guilt. It did not suggest intent. It simply stated that the available evidence was insufficient to determine how Jessie had died. From an institutional perspective, this was a responsible classification. The legal threshold for declaring a homicide had not been met. Without that threshold, a murder investigation could not proceed in the traditional sense. Resources were allocated elsewhere. Active lines of inquiry were closed. To the public, however, the meaning of an open verdict was less precise. Many interpreted it as an indication that nothing criminal had occurred. Others assumed it meant the truth was unknowable and therefore settled. The nuance between unproven and unlikely was rarely discussed. Media coverage reflected this ambiguity. Reports were brief. Language remained restrained. The story did not develop beyond the facts already known. And gradually, the case receded from attention. Within police records, Jessie Earl's file moved from active review to archival status. It was not marked as solved, but it was no longer pursued. There was no suspect to monitor, no charge to prepare, no court process to anticipate. This distinction mattered, because cases classified as unsolved homicides follow different preservation protocols. Evidence is retained. Materials are cataloged with the assumption that future advances may allow new testing. But an open verdict did not trigger those same safeguards. In 1997, nearly 17 years after Jessie was last seen, physical evidence associated with the case was destroyed in line with standard procedures for non-criminal deaths. At the time, this action attracted little notice. The case was not viewed as ongoing. There was no expectation that it would be reopened. From an administrative standpoint, the process was complete. For Jessie's family, the conclusion felt different. They had never understood how the circumstances surrounding her discovery could lead to uncertainty rather than suspicion. The bindings, the absence of personal belongings, the location. These details did not align with accidental death in their minds. But the official record stood, and without new information, challenging it required more than disagreement. It required evidence that no longer existed. Years passed. Investigators retired. Procedures evolved. Public conversations about forensic accountability began to change. And quietly, without announcement, the assumptions that shaped the original conclusion aged. What had once been seen as insufficient evidence would later be viewed through a different lens. What had once been considered inconclusive would later raise clearer questions. And what had once been categorized as unresolved would eventually be reconsidered entirely. But by then, much of what might have clarified the truth was gone. The official conclusion had done what conclusions often do. It had ended the process. And in doing so, it determined how the case would be remembered. Not as an investigation that had paused, but as one that had finished. In the official record, most aspects of Jessie Earl's death were treated as inconclusive rather than contradictory. There was no single moment where investigators noted a clear error. No obvious failure that demanded immediate correction. But within the details that were documented, there was one element that sat quietly on the page. It was recorded. It was acknowledged. And then it was set aside. When Jessie's remains were discovered at Beachy Head, her wrists were bound with her own bra. The knot was noted in the report, described without emphasis, and cataloged as part of the scene. At the time, this detail was considered unusual, but not decisive. Investigators did not dispute its presence. They did not question whether it had occurred. They simply did not treat it as determinative. The prevailing explanation was that the binding could not, on its own, establish what had taken place. Without additional corroboration, without a witness, without traceable forensic evidence, it was not seen as sufficient to redefine the case. And so it remained exactly where it was found in the paperwork, described but unexplored. There were no extended inquiries into how the knot had been tied, no recorded analysis of whether it could have been self-applied under the circumstances, no reconstruction attempting to place that action within a clear sequence of events. This was not because the detail was ignored. It was because it was categorized as insignificant in the absence of supporting proof. At the time, investigators were trained to look for patterns that could be confirmed, not anomalies that could not be explained. A single irregularity, without a broader framework, did not outweigh the absence of demonstrable criminal evidence. But viewed in isolation, the binding did not appear alarming. Viewed within the assumptions of the era, it did not demand escalation. It was, in the language of the case files, an unusual feature without confirmed relevance. The same applied to the absence of Jesse's personal belongings. No handbag, no identification, no clothing beyond what remained at the site. This, too, was documented carefully. It was treated as circumstantial. Beachy Head was known for its exposure to wind, wildlife, and time. Objects left in the open could be displaced. Items could disappear without human intervention. These explanations were reasonable within the context available then. And because each detail could be explained independently, there was no requirement to consider them collectively. That distinction mattered, because when details are examined separately, they lose the ability to challenge the larger narrative. They become footnotes rather than signals. In this case, the binding was a footnote. The missing belongings were another. The length of time Jesse remained undiscovered was treated as environmental rather than contextual. None of these elements were false. None were dismissed outright. They were simply not pursued. There was no moment where investigators stopped and asked whether these details, taken together, suggested a different line of inquiry. No formal review that tested whether the explanation still held when each irregularity was placed side by side. Instead, the conclusion shaped the interpretation of the details, rather than the details shaping the conclusion. This was not uncommon. It was procedural. Once the case was categorized as unresolved rather than criminal, the threshold for reinterpretation rose significantly. Every unanswered question required justification to exist at all, and so the detail remained, recorded, unchallenged, waiting, not as evidence of wrongdoing, not as proof of anything at all, just something that never fully aligned with the explanation that followed. When the events surrounding Jessica Earl's disappearance are laid out in sequence, the timeline appears straightforward at first glance. She was last known to be alive in May 1980, after making a brief phone call to her mother from a phone box near the seafront in Eastbourne. There was nothing in the call that suggested distress, no indication that she anticipated danger. The conversation ended normally. After that moment, the record becomes quiet. Jessie did not return home. No confirmed sightings were documented. No verified interactions followed. Search efforts began within the limitations of the time. Areas she was known to walk were checked. Local inquiries were made, but without a specific destination or witness account. The search relied largely on probability rather than direction. Then the timeline stretches. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. By the time Jessie's remains were discovered in 1989, nearly 9 years had passed since she was last seen. This gap reshaped how the case was understood. In many investigations, time compresses events. Here, time expanded them. The location where Jessie was found, Beachy Head, was a place she was familiar with. It was also a location known to authorities, one that had been searched intermittently over the years for unrelated reasons. This raised an early question that was noted but never fully clarified. If the remains had been present in that location for nearly a decade, how had they gone unnoticed? The explanation offered at the time focused on terrain and vegetation. Beachy Head's landscape includes dense undergrowth and steep, uneven ground. Visibility changes seasonally. Access can be limited. These factors were reasonable. They accounted for delay. They aligned with experience, but they did not establish certainty. Another point in the timeline concerned the condition in which Jessie was found. The binding at her wrists. The absence of clothing and belongings. The lack of clear indicators of cause of death. Each of these details existed in the same moment, yet they were not interpreted as part of a single sequence of actions. Instead, they were treated as static observations, detached from chronology. What was never fully clarified was the order in which events might have occurred. When were the bindings applied? At what point were belongings separated from a body? How long after Jessie's disappearance did her body arrive at the location where it was eventually found? The official record does not provide answers to these questions. That absence was not the result of negligence. It reflected the limitations of the evidence available after so much time had passed. But it also meant that the timeline relied heavily on assumption. The assumption that Jessie had traveled directly to Beachy Head. The assumption that no other location was involved. The assumption that the condition in which she was found reflected her final moments rather than subsequent exposure. These assumptions were never tested against alternatives, because there was no procedural requirement to do so. In cases classified as unresolved but non-criminal, timelines are often descriptive rather than investigative. They document what is known without probing what might be missing. As a result, certain gaps remained unexamined. The period between Jessie's last confirmed contact and her arrival at Beachy Head was never reconstructed in detail. The possibility of intermediate locations was not explored. The absence of personal items was not placed within a temporal framework. Each gap raised questions. Not questions of blame. Not questions of intent. Questions of sequence. And sequence matters. Because when timelines are compressed, when years of uncertainty are reduced to a single assumed path, details that might challenge the conclusion lose their context. In this case, the timeline did not contradict the accepted explanation, but did not fully support it either. It left uncertainty where clarity was expected. It left assumptions where verification was missing. And it left open the possibility that the order of events was more complex than the conclusion allowed. That complexity was never resolved. To understand how this case reached its conclusion, it helps to look not at the evidence alone, but at the human processes that interpret it. Investigations are conducted by people. People working within time constraints. People operating under expectation and responsibility. When an incident lacks clear indicators of criminal involvement, investigators face a particular kind of pressure. There is a need to determine whether further resources should be committed or whether the matter can be concluded within existing parameters. In those moments, decision-making often shifts from exploration to classification. Psychological research has shown that under uncertainty, the human mind seeks coherence. Not necessarily truth in its fullest sense, but an explanation that aligns available facts into a complete picture. Once such a picture forms, it becomes the reference point for everything that follows. This is known as cognitive anchoring. An initial assessment, especially one reached early, tends to influence how subsequent information is interpreted. Details that support the assessment are given weight. Details that complicate it are viewed as peripheral. This does not require intent. It does not require error. It requires only normal human cognition. In Jessica Earl's case, the early classification of the death as unresolved but non-criminal created a framework through which every detail was filtered. Within that framework, uncertainty was expected. Ambiguity was acceptable. Unexplained elements were not necessarily problematic. Stress also plays a role. Investigators working on cases with limited evidence must balance thoroughness against feasibility. The absence of witnesses, the passage of time, and environmental exposure all increase cognitive load. Under these conditions, The brain prioritizes what can be verified over what cannot. Memory, too, is affected. Witness recollections fade. Investigative impressions solidify. Early interpretations become institutional memory. Once a conclusion is documented, it gains a kind of psychological weight. Revisiting it requires not only new information, but justification for reopening a settled matter. This creates what behavioral scientists describe as commitment bias, a tendency to maintain an existing position in the absence of overwhelming reason to change it. Institutions are not immune to this effect. Procedures are designed to move forward. Case statuses determine resource allocation. Resolved matters, even unresolved ones, fall lower on the priority scale. As time passes, the likelihood of reevaluation decreases, not because questions disappear, but because the system assumes they have already been answered as well as possible. In this environment, early conclusions tend to harden. They become part of training materials. They inform internal discussions. They shape how future reviews are framed, if they occur at all. This is not a failure of ethics. It is a byproduct of human and institutional behavior, and it explains how a case can remain unsettled while still being treated as complete. In Jessica Earl's case, the conclusion did not close because it was perfect. It closed because it fit the available framework. And once that framework was established, every uncertainty that followed existed within its boundaries rather than challenging them. Understanding this process does not assign fault. It provides context, because when conclusions form under constraint, they often reflect the conditions of their formation as much as the facts themselves. Beyond the details that were recorded, there existed an entire realm of the case that never received focused attention. Not ignored, deprioritized. Not hidden, overlooked. Simply unexamined in any systematic way. Investigators at the time followed procedures suited to the classification of the death. Unresolved, but not criminal. In that framework, only evidence that could confirm a homicide would be actively pursued. Everything else became ancillary. Several leads, while documented, were never developed. Witnesses whose statements might have provided context were never re-interviewed. Locations where Jessie was known to walk were only searched sporadically. Items she carried or locations she frequented were not revisited after initial checks. Questions that naturally arise when examining any missing person, timing, movement, potential interactions, were never fully reconstructed. Each untested assumption created a gap in the record, a space where clarity might have emerged if different priorities had been applied. Even procedural opportunities were missed. Standard practices that could have preserved more evidence or allowed for further forensic analysis were either not yet established or not considered necessary under the open verdict classification. Evidence that might have illuminated the sequence of events was later destroyed according to policy. In the absence of these investigations, what remained was a set of recorded observations. Each observation was accurate as noted, but taken in isolation, they left open questions about the sequence, context, and circumstances surrounding Jessie's final movements. The cumulative effect was subtle but significant. When later investigators returned to the case, they confronted not a falsified record, but a landscape of gaps. Each absence required interpretation. Each omission required cautious consideration. And together, these absences created the sense that the story was more complex than originally portrayed. What wasn't explored does not prove anything. It does not suggest intent or culpability. It does not contradict the facts that were established. What it does illustrate is the way in which procedural decisions, prioritization, and classification shape understanding. Sometimes, what is left unexamined weighs as heavily as what is recorded. And in Jessica Earl's case, those spaces between the known and the unknown would become central to the questions asked decades later. Years passed, not in sudden leaps, but quietly, slowly. The case remained in the archives, files stacked in drawers, reports cataloged, paper and ink preserved, digital records non-existent. Evidence aged, materials decayed. Fragments that could have offered insight were lost to time. What was once tangible became fragile. What was once immediate became historical. Attention shifted elsewhere. New incidents, new investigations, new priorities. The machinery of law enforcement continued to turn, leaving the case behind in procedural silence. Closure became institutionalized. The classification of the death, the open verdict, the limited investigation, each became part of the official narrative. A record was set. A precedent was maintained. Questions, no matter how persistent, could be answered only by the constraints of what was documented. Time did more than age evidence. It shaped perception. Family and friends continued to remember Jesse Earl. They did not forget, but the system moved forward. The absence of review, the lack of re-examination, reinforced the perception that the matter had concluded. And in that silence, certainty became easier to accept. The conclusion, once procedural, began to feel permanent. Yet permanence is not truth. It is only what remains unchallenged. In this space between action and reflection, the story existed as it would for many years, settled in procedure, unsettled in understanding. If the events surrounding Jesse Earl's disappearance occurred in the present day, the approach would look very different. Modern investigative standards emphasize comprehensive preservation of evidence, even in cases where cause of death is not immediately clear. Every item recovered, every trace of biological material, is cataloged, photographed, and stored under strict conditions. DNA analysis, once unavailable, would be applied from the outset. Procedural safeguards ensure that initial classifications do not limit future review. Open cases are revisited systematically. Investigators are trained to question assumptions, to reconstruct timelines with advanced techniques, and to analyze scenes in ways that were impossible decades ago. Behavioral analysis, geographic profiling, and digital mapping provide additional context. Witness statements are cross-referenced with broader data sets. Even minor inconsistencies are investigated thoroughly. In this light, details that were once considered insignificant, the bindings on Jesse's wrists, the absence of personal belongings, the location of her remains, would be documented and analyzed within a structured investigative framework. Their sequence, relation, and potential significance would be explored rather than set aside. Yet even with these tools, certainty is not guaranteed. What today's investigators would gain is clarity of process and the ability to ask new questions. The past cannot be changed, but it can be understood through the lens of contemporary standards. In many ways, the value lies not in finding a definitive answer that was previously missing, but in applying modern scrutiny to the existing record. Patterns can be recognized. Gaps can be highlighted. Unanswered questions can be formalized. The case, viewed today, would not simply be reopened. It would be approached differently. Each detail would be reconsidered, each assumption challenged. And in doing so, the story would gain depth, precision, and perspective. This is the benefit of time and progress. Not resolution, not finality, but perspective. After decades of review, certain facts about Jesse Earl's case remain clear. She was last seen alive in Eastbourne in May 1980. Her remains were discovered years later at Beachy Head. Physical evidence confirmed her identity and some aspects of how she was found. Beyond these facts, much remains unclear. The sequence of events between her final phone call and the discovery of her remains is not fully reconstructed. How and when her personal belongings were removed, and by whom or what, is not determined. The circumstances surrounding the bindings on her wrists are not fully understood. These are not mysteries of imagination. They are gaps in the record, places where documentation and evidence leave questions open. Doubt persists, not because the original investigation was negligent, but because the passage of time, procedural constraints, and classification decisions left these questions unanswered. This is the space in which the story exists today, a space where certainty ends and careful curiosity begins. It is the promise of this channel to explore cases with diligence, to acknowledge the known, and to highlight the unknown, to respect those involved while examining how and why some stories remain unresolved long after they first began. The investigation followed the procedures and standards of its time. Every step, every report, every decision reflected the tools, knowledge, and priorities that guided the authorities. Those involved, family, friends, and investigators, approached their roles with care and diligence. Their work shaped the record we examine today. Yet, even with all that effort, the story remains incomplete. Questions linger. Details remain unexplained. Moments that might have offered clarity were never fully reconstructed. And that is the space we leave the viewer in, not with accusation, not with certainty, but with reflection. A reminder that some stories, no matter how thoroughly documented, resist final understanding. The case may be closed, but understanding doesn't always arrive on schedule. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to Unresolved Years to explore more unresolved cases from around the world. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new investigation. And let us know your thoughts. What questions do you think remain unanswered in this case? Comment below. Your curiosity keeps these stories alive.